When a method returns, if that method's not void, then it actually returns a value. And a method always returns just a single value. And that value can be a primitive type, like a float, a short, a boolean. It can also be a reference to an object, and it can even be a reference to an array, because in Java, arrays are objects. So let's take a look at that flight class we've been working with. Now remember that it has two fields in it, passengers and seats. And for now, I'm not going to show the other methods we've seen already. I want to focus on some new methods we're going to add here. So let's say we have a method that we want to check and see that is there room to combine the passengers from another flight with those passengers on this flight. So you notice we pass in a parameter, which is the other flight we call F2, and our return type is Boolean. So what we can say here is that we'll figure out the total number of passengers. So how many passengers do we have with how many passengers does the other flight have? And then we check and see, well, if that total is less than or equal to the number of seats we have, we'll return true. Otherwise, we'll return false. Right? So that, in this case, it's a method returning back a Boolean variable. Notice the code we're using for our return value here. If total less than or equal to seats resolves to true, we then return true. If total less than or equal to seats resolves to false, we return false. Well, rather than actually have the if then the return, why don't we just use that value directly? So what we can do is we can replace that if statement by simply saying return total less than or equal to seats. Whatever that resolves to, it will be our return value. So let's make a little more room here since we have got rid of some of that code. Let's create another method here. This method we'll call create new with both. And you notice that this one returns back a reference to a flight object. And the idea here is that it will actually create a brand new flight that combines the passenger counts from the current flight and that flight F2 that's passed in. So what we'll do here is we'll create a new instance of the flight object. We will then say the number of seats in that new flight is equal to the number of seats that our current flight object has. And then the number of passengers is the combined of our passengers and the other flight. And then we'll just return back this newly created flight. We're returning back a reference to this new flight that we created. So to use this in code, what we'll do is let's go ahead and declare one flight instance. That'll be a flight to LAX, to Los Angeles. That'll be our flight LAX1. We'll create another flight to Los Angeles, LAX2. And we'll say that we just run some code that adds passengers to both of these flights. So upon some point, when we get past this comment, both LAX1 and LAX2 has some number of passengers. So what I'm going to do is create a new flight reference. But notice I'm not creating a flight, it's just a flight reference. And what I want to do now is check to see that, well, if there's room to combine LAX1 and LAX2 passengers, I want to go ahead and do that. So what I'll do here is have an if statement in place that says, well, if LAX1.hasRoom LAX2. Right, that calls over to our hasRoom method. When we get into the hasRoom method, because we called hasRoom against the LAX1 flight instance, anywhere we refer to the class member variables passengers and seats where they're unqualified, that means we're referring to the values that are currently in LAX1. When we refer to passengers using the F2 reference, right, that's actually LAX2's passengers because that's the one we passed into the parameter. Right, so when we run this method, it basically adds those together, and then if there's room, it'll return back true. Right, if there's not, it'll return back false. Right, so then we can go ahead and say LAX3 equals LAX1.create new with both, passing LAX2. So now again, control transfers over to the create new with both. Again, because we called this against LAX1, anywhere we use seats or passengers unqualified, those are the LAX1 seats. F2 passengers will be the LAX2 passengers. So in this code, we go ahead and create that new flight instance, assign it the number of seats from LAX1, right, the flight reference we were called against, and then passengers is set to the value of LAX1's passengers plus LAX2's passengers. And then we return back that new flight. So LAX3 will receive a reference to that newly created flight instance returned back from the create new with both method.